The night air was cold enough to sting Daniel's face as he stood at the dimly lit bus stop, his worn jacket doing little to shield him from the biting wind. In his arms, his 4-year-old daughter Emma was fast asleep, her tiny head resting against his chest, wrapped in a faded pink blanket that had seen better days. Being a single father had taught Daniel resilience, but it hadn't made life easier. Long shifts at the construction site drained his strength, and nights like this, waiting for the late bus, made him feel the weight of every responsibility on his shoulders. Just as he adjusted Emma to keep her warmer, his eyes fell on a woman sitting at the far end of the bench. She was hunched forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Strands of her glossy dark hair clung to her damp cheeks, and though her tailored coat and polished boots spoke of money and sophistication, in that moment she looked heartbreakingly fragile. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't the type to pry into strangers' lives, but something about the way she trembled made him step closer. "Are you okay, miss?" he asked softly, lowering his voice so as not to wake Emma. The woman startled, quickly brushing at her tears as if ashamed of being caught. For a moment her eyes, glassy with sorrow, locked onto his, and Daniel saw pain buried so deep it almost frightened him. I just don't know where to go tonight," she whispered, her voice trembling like brittle glass ready to shatter. Daniel, not knowing what else to do, took off his jacket despite the cold and draped it gently over her shoulders. "It's not much, but it'll keep you warm until the bus comes," he said with a small, reassuring smile. She stared at him, stunned by the simple act of kindness, her lips parting as though she wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. When the bus finally pulled up, Daniel helped her stand, steadying her as she climbed aboard. She paused on the step, glancing back at him with a look he couldn't quite decipher, gratitude, sadness, maybe even a silent plea for understanding. Then she was gone, swallowed by the bus's dim interior lights and the roar of its engine as it pulled away. Daniel stood there in the cold with Emma still sleeping in his arms, telling himself it was just another passing encounter with a stranger. Yet deep down, he knew there was something about that woman's eyes that he would not soon forget. The following evening, Daniel once again stood at the same bus stop, Emma nestled in his arms after another grueling day at work. He wasn't expecting anything different. To him, the bus stop was just part of his nightly routine, a place where tired souls gathered briefly before scattering into the city's restless night. But as he shifted his weight and tried to keep Emma warm, his heart skipped when he noticed her, the same woman from the night before. She wasn't slumped in despair this time. Her posture was straighter, her hair neatly tied back, and her coat buttoned with purpose. The tears that had streaked her face last night were gone, replaced by a calm determination that made her seem almost like a different person. When her eyes found his, a faint smile tugged at her lips, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. "You," she said softly, walking closer, "I wanted to thank you for last night. You didn't have to help me, but you did. You were the first person in a long time who cared enough to ask if I was okay." Daniel adjusted Emma against his shoulder, feeling suddenly awkward beneath her steady gaze, and shrugged lightly. "It was nothing, just being human," he replied. Yet her eyes lingered on him, as if she wanted to tell him it had been much more than nothing. After a long pause, she lowered her voice, glancing around as though the shadows themselves might overhear. "I wasn't just upset yesterday," she admitted, her tone trembling but resolute. "I was running away, from a life that looks perfect to everyone else but feels like a prison to me. People think I have everything, but the truth is, I feel like I have nothing." She let out a humorless laugh, one that sounded more like resignation than amusement. Daniel didn't press for details. Instead, he offered her the only thing he knew, quiet understanding. He looked down at Emma, who stirred slightly in her sleep, and then back at the woman. "Well, if it helps, she thought you were pretty great. Slept through the whole thing." The woman chuckled softly, and for the first time, her eyes held warmth instead of sorrow. She hesitated before extending her hand. "My name's Claire," she said finally, as if revealing it carried weight. Then, with a look that carried both mystery and promise, she added, "And something tells me this won't be the last time we meet." In the days that followed, Daniel began to notice a pattern. Claire was no longer a fleeting shadow from one night, but a constant presence at the bus stop, as if she had decided to carve out a piece of her world in his. Sometimes she arrived with 2 steaming cups of coffee, pressing one into his chilled hands with a smile that warmed more than the drink. Other times she carried small toys or books that made Emma's eyes light up with innocent delight. Daniel, though cautious, couldn't deny how naturally Claire blended into their little routines, how she crouched down to Emma's level and listened to her childish ramblings with the patience of someone who truly cared. There was something unusual about her. Her words carried a refinement, her gestures hinted at grace, and her bag alone probably cost more than Daniel made in a month, yet she seemed determined to leave all of that behind at the bus stop, where she was simply Claire, a woman who laughed easily and listened without judgment. One night, rain hammered the roof of the flimsy shelter, and Daniel struggled to keep Emma dry beneath his jacket. Without hesitation, Claire opened a wide umbrella and held it over the 3 of them, her arms steady even as droplets splattered her shoes. "You shouldn't have to do this alone," she murmured, glancing at Emma with a tenderness that caught Daniel off guard. He studied her in the flickering streetlight, sensing the weight behind her words. "You sound like you know what that's like," he said carefully. For a long moment, she didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the storm. Finally, her voice broke through the downpour, soft and raw. "Loneliness is a cruel thing, Daniel. Sometimes even surrounded by people, you feel invisible." Her confession lingered between them, heavy yet intimate, and Daniel found himself wanting to understand the hidden life she kept locked away. When the bus arrived, Claire surprised him by not boarding. She lingered instead, her gaze searching his as though waiting for him to speak. The words left his mouth before he could second-guess them. "Come with us," he offered quietly. "It's just a small apartment, nothing special, but maybe you don't need to be alone tonight." Claire's eyes shimmered with emotion, and for the first time she nodded without hesitation. Emma, half asleep, reached out and wrapped her tiny hand around Claire's fingers, sealing a bond that none of them yet understood but all of them felt. It was late the following evening when Daniel finally understood the depth of the secret Claire had been carrying. After tucking Emma into bed, he turned on the small, flickering television in his apartment, and there she was, her face filling the screen, framed by bold letters that read "Missing Heiress." The reporter's voice was crisp, announcing that Claire Montgomery, the elusive CEO of Montgomery Enterprises and heiress to one of the largest fortunes in the city, had been absent from her high-profile engagements for days, sparking concern across the business world. Daniel's heart pounded as he stared at the woman he had come to know not as a CEO but as a vulnerable soul who carried umbrellas in the rain and toys for his daughter. The revelation made his head spin. The Claire who laughed at Emma's silly jokes and shared quiet truths at the bus stop was suddenly a figure of wealth and power, yet it was clear she had been running from exactly that. When he saw her again the next night, he couldn't hold back the question. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked gently, his tone more wounded than angry. Claire's eyes softened with shame, and she looked away before answering. "Because with you, Daniel, I wasn't an heiress, or a CEO, or a headline on the news. With you, I could just be me. And I was so afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd see me differently." Daniel studied her face, seeing the same woman who had shivered in despair on a cold bench and the same one who had reached for Emma's hand as if it were second nature. "All I saw was someone who needed kindness," he said quietly, "and that hasn't changed." For the first time since he'd met her, Claire's tears weren't born of sorrow but of relief, as if someone had finally seen past the glittering cage she had tried to escape. Emma stirred awake and toddled over, tugging at Claire's coat with sleepy affection, and Claire bent down to hug her with trembling arms. In that simple embrace, Daniel realized that the woman who had once been a stranger at the bus stop had become something much more, a friend, perhaps more than a friend, and maybe the missing piece in the family he never thought he'd find. And as Claire whispered, "Maybe I've finally found where I belong," Daniel understood that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion could open the door to an entirely new life.